Ladies and gentlemen, we often say on this podcast that South Africa is turning into just another African country, but reading a piece written by a good friend of the channel, David Ansara, who is the CEO of the Free Market Foundation, maybe that is absolutely incorrect. South Africa is not just another African country because African countries are experiencing no load shedding, a lot of economic growth, and devolution of political power. In this particular case, it is Kenya. So, Byron, let's talk about Kenya. I never had the good fortune of going to Kenya, but I've been to Zambia, so it's sort of close by.
So David says he's been to Kenya a number of times, especially in recent years. So he says that in that time, every time he goes, he notices economic growth. Kenya now having 5% growth as opposed to South Africa's don't really know what grow is. I mean, South Africa, we don't grow things here. We redistribute power. We don't grow it. David says that the thing that strikes him is that even if you want to see whether a country is growing, you go to the most rural, crappy, out the way places where you usually expect things to be static. Says he goes to those areas, and even those areas are seeing economic growth. Growth of skyscrapers, urbanization. People actually get. David says the biggest thing that he noticed was he sat there with his phone pinging him messages, and he says, "But Kenya had power." So he said that for him was a big thing. He says he actually spoke to Kenyans about this. He says Kenyans all know about South Africa's energy troubles, and they all think it's funny.
And I think this is like the thing about Africa most people don't realize. The continent as a whole is growing quite well. Like I think the average emerging market is like 3.7 to 4.5%. Most of Africa is an emerging market. Most countries within it are emerging markets. And yeah, they're getting lots of economic growth. They've got alternative payment systems. The latter is far less than what you find in South Africa. Fewer beggars on the streets than in South Africa. And most importantly, they've got some bloody electricity, which we don't have in South Africa. In fact, right at the end of the piece, David refers to a story where basically someone in Kenya told him, South Africa's like that rich uncle you once admired. He lived in a large mansion, had fine cars and furniture and modern appliances. You always wanted to be like him. But now, a few years later, you realize he's not so special. He's fallen on hard times. His house is a bit run down. And he's just very much like the rest of us. But in this case, South Africa is not like the rest of Africa. South Africa is far behind the rest of Africa. In the quest to become another African country, we are falling far behind the rest of Africa. Like that's the ANC legacy for South Africa. That's not very nice.
No, and I suppose it's expected though, isn't it? Because if you look at the way the ANC's prioritized decentralization programs, meaning that basically all of the economic activity now is dictated by the central bureaucracy, and we all know how useless the central bureaucracy is, then what you inevitably find is that rather than do any form of economic growth, the central bureaucracy steals all of the available cash for economic growth. Whereas what David highlights as being the saving grace for Kenya was actually their devolution drive, which they experienced when they redrafted their new constitution in 2010. So following that redrafting, where devolved everything, David even highlights that the legal framework that followed that isn't really that clear. But that hasn't stopped Kenyans, because what he's found is that Kenyans now feel highly skeptical of the state, but less skeptical of themselves. And Kenyans are a bit like what we said the other day. Kenyans mark a plan. And as Kenyans that mark a plan, they've made a plan to make sure that their country actually works for them and they have economic growth. Whereas, as we know, in South Africa, die mense maak fuck all plan. And as a result, we have economic growth of fuck all. So...
yeah, very much so. Very much so. The great thing about that word, fuck all, is that Google doesn't pick it up as a swear word, so we're allowed to use it without being demonetized. It's really, really wonderful. What's interesting about the Kenyan devolution is that it's been in the works, I think since 2010, if I'm not mistaken. And basically they voted, it was a democratic vote. For once, the democratic vote actually did some good to decentralize the government. So therefore, now there's 47 governors basically having power over newly created counties. So it sounds a little bit like a state within America. So you got the federal state, which has a lot of power. You got the federal state, which has a lot more power. But also they've got counties within the states. And those counties vote on who the sheriff is, vote on who the attorney general is, get the most taxes from the people who live within that county. So it looks like that's what they try to do in Kenya. And it seems to be paying quite a few dividends because, as David says in his piece, no Kenyan ever says, yes, the government's coming to save me. They're like, the
No,
government's
they
there.
think we'll fix it ourselves.
Yeah, we just have to do it within ourselves. And I think the average Kenyan is not markedly different from the average South African in this case. But what the ANC has done, they've created such a culture of entitlement with their grants and their public education, and trying to hold on as much centralized power as possible and redistribute it to everyone else. That entitlement is impossible to actually pursue because there's no money and they've stolen everything. Whereas in the rest of Africa, there was never that entitlement in the first place.
No, and if you look at it, one of the other things David says is that Kenyans are noticeably conservative, that they basically have a belief that the government isn't there to help them. In fact, he actually highlights that they all believe their government is corrupt. Sound familiar, guys? Like, we believe our government's corrupt too. And because of that, they never feel that the government can actually save them from anything. They actually believe the government is a hindrance. So as a result, they just make plans for themselves, which to a large degree is actually what we do, Ramon, and it's what we promote on Morning Show. We say, make your own plan and get on with it. We also admit, we say, the majority of South Africans are conservative. They're devoutly religious. They're blunt, and like he says, very direct. That is most Boers, right? And most South Africans. They're not there to follow Western progressive ideals. And what we find in the ANC is that the ANC want to be African, but they want to follow Western ideals. And as a result, we just have this kind of like Westernized African bullshit mixed with a little bit of redistributive communism. Yeah. And as a country, politically, it's just confused. And that confusedness means that economically we can never actually get together with a policy framework that's coherent. I mean, today we'll sit down with the Americans and we'll come up with an economic plan. Tomorrow we'll sit down with the Russians and come up with an economic plan. And then we'll have a Legotha to just debate whether or not we should have an economic plan.
Sorry, Byron, stop thinking like a white person. It's a Legotla, please. Use the correct terminology. You in Africa, you use African terms, okay?
Ja, mensen. Ik verstaan.
Very good. Also like your other Byronism, confusedness. We should actually cut up each video with the Byronism and just make an extended Byronism, extended cut. Release that on YouTube.
But it is confusedness because it's just confused. Like the whole point of it is bullshit. Yeah. And then tomorrow we're gonna have another discussion. We're gonna have a stakeholder engagement and see whether or not we need more economic plans, right? And then we're going to come up with a plan, and then we're going to be like, let's take it to the stakeholders. And then the stakeholders are going to say, maybe we should have a plan, and we'll take it to the NEC. And the NEC will say, no, we don't need a plan. So then we'll go back to the drawing board, and you'll be like, well, that was 5 years wasted. Yeah. I mean, this is the ANC way, mate.
It's like when Cyril Ramaphosa tweeted out this week that he had, to end load shedding, he had meetings with the church, labor groups, civil society groups, and opposition parties. It's like, okay, great. Did you speak to anyone who's interested or have any expertise at all in energy production? No, you didn't. You just wanked around with your mates talking about how you're going to solve a crisis that you created in the first place.
And then you got Mr. Fix for Call to go on TV and say, hey, guys, we talked about electricity all day. And whilst he was midway through his speech, the whole thing cut to black because he had load shedding. You're like, yeah, that talk was productive, huh?
That's someone who doesn't rely on Eskom's to push for load shedding notifications. We see you, Mr. Fix for Call. You can't even fix your own load shedding schedule. You don't even know. How embarrassing. But anyway,
I know it's going off on a tangent on one, but we called this. Like, that guy is so fucking useless. He was going to break even the ANC, yeah. And we're seeing it right now. He's happening. Like, it's happening before our eyes. Like, and it's glorious.
It is glorious, but unlike South Africa, Kenya knows what it wants. Most importantly, Kenyans know what they want. They know the state's not going to save them. They do like the devolution of power because they voted for it. And yeah, there's a few issues there. They're worried about terrorism and all the rest of it, but are they on the way up? We are not. And in some ways, South Africa is not just another African country. South Africa is a shithole country. But that's why we love it.
Thanks to the ANC.
Thanks to the ANC, but that's why we love it. And that's why you should live in the Eastern Cape. That is overwhelmingly ANC because it's such a shithole. Any sense of order is allowed.
Absolutely. And in a way, the ANC is actually getting that ideal that Kenyans have, just not through design, right? They're doing it by fluke. Like the Kenyans were like, nope, we want this. South Africans are like, we had to have it because we tried the other alternative and it wasn't so lekker. So the problem that we're now experiencing with the ANC is that they couldn't piss up in a brewery. They couldn't eat a chocolate bar in a chocolate factory. Like these guys are just, I don't know, man. They just can't sort anything out. And as a result, South Africans have an inherent distrust of their political parties. And I'm glad we're talking about this, because the one problem or the one flaw in this whole thing is that whilst we have no trust in our political parties and we recognize that the people that govern us are stupid, for some reason people still think that the government is going to fix their problems, which Kenya, that's a belief, that's a fairy tale that Kenyans have shed, and that's why they're
Yes.
doing so well.
Exactly. There's no African fairy tale, my friends. All you have to understand is no one's come to save you. The government doesn't really care about you, and you can make money. And if you have that as a mindset, you can be the Kenya of 2023. If you don't have the mindset, you can be the poor soul left in South Africa who cries whenever load shedding hits them because they haven't made a plan to deal with it.